fucking news outlet. All of these issues are constantly framed by people from both sides as being part of some larger culture war that needs to be fought and won. This, I think, is a mistake. I just haven't quite worked out yet whether it's an intentional mistake, because this culture war is really starting to feel like our very own version of the perpetual war in Orwell's 1984. Quick everyone, look at what the Wall Street Journal's doing. We need to fight back. A children's book where Black Santa marries his gay husband. That'll show those racist homophobes. Oh, the regressive left is blocking people on Twitter. Personal pronouns like he and she are problematic. I mean, consider the fact that everyone knows a debate is not about convincing your opponent, but winning over the undecided minds in the middle. That being the case, I have to ask, apart from view counts, what is actually gained by anyone when two YouTubers with devout subscription audiences have a debate and then go back to their respective little corners of the internet to proclaim that they pwned the other guy? Then, out of the blue, someone gets punched in the face and suddenly the alliances all shift again, reminiscent of Oceania always being at war with East Asia. Big Brother needs your Patreon money to fight the good fight. No ground is ever actually lost or gained, but everyone feels like they're making progress against their ideological enemies. It's all illusionary. There is no real culture war going on, there is just culture. And that culture is ultimately reflective of our underlying biology and psychology. I've mentioned this in older videos, but this is exactly why Gamergate failed. Gamergate tried to hold people like Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn accountable for their actions and their stated positions. But the fact is that according to the rules of this reproductive game that we've dressed up and called civilization, having a vagina trumps having sound logical arguments. It doesn't matter how stupid or hypocritical or cringeworthy they are. Pretty feminists need only cry misogyny and harassment, and all of your criticism, no matter how thoughtful or correct, is immediately invalidated. Gamergate lost because they made the mistake of bringing a cultural knife to a biological gunfight. They never stood a chance because, as Sun Tzu would say, they didn't know their enemy. Feminists are fraudulent hypocrites, you say? Well, that's nice, but when all the smoke has cleared from this supposedly intellectual battlefield, who are the ones actually addressing the United Nations on matters of internet harassment? And this is why I think this so-called culture war we see happening across the internet right now is so similar to the Forever War in 1984, which, as alluded to in the book, may not have even been happening at all, but served the practical purpose of maintaining the proles' nationalistic support in the party. The only thing that Gamergate actually achieved was to grow the subscriber numbers and Patreon accounts, the, shall we say, vested interests of certain individuals. Speaking of people who struck internet gold during the failed revolution that was Gamergate, I cannot think of a better example to highlight what it really means getting embroiled in this perpetual culture war than the infamous livestream where Sargon told Stardust that even though gynocentrism is a real thing, we shouldn't talk about it because it's quote-unquote bad for PR.
Okay, that's true. That's all completely true. And you're right, it is the innate desire of men to cater to women that is leading to them getting lower prison sentences and all this sort of stuff.
Right.
And completely biased family courts.
And I don't know if we can fix it, but the awareness is important.
And you're right. However, gynocentrism, talking from like a PR perspective, is not the right word.
And instead, we should discuss these gender differences in terms of egalitarianism.
Real. People are turned off by it.
Yeah.
But
perhaps, but I mean,
it's technically accurate though. But I think there might be a better way of phrasing it, and I think the way to phrase it would be anti-egalitarian.
Well, I'm sorry, but egalitarianism has no power to explain the reproductive dynamic between men and women. egalitarianism is an ideological and legal concept that has only practically existed in a handful of Western industrialised nations for about the last 50 years or so. It cannot even begin to explain the psychology behind a man going off to die in World War I because some bitch he'd never even met handed him a white feather. You cannot examine and explain the deep underlying reproductive behaviours we're concerned with through the lens of a recent Western political ideology. This is really the problem with all of these so-called pop culture critics and social commentators who are largely driven by some kind of personal identitarian agenda. They all claim to have the ideological fix for whatever culturally ails you. Whether it's our former MRA friend from the Logic video complaining about Tim the Toolman spreading misandry, or it's Anita Sarkeesian decrying the fact that Mario enforces harmful gender stereotypes. It's a bizarre paradox, but when you think about it, even those claiming to fight cultural Marxism are by definition social constructivists themselves. If they do truly believe that a 50-page manifesto from 150 years ago, which no one's ever even read, is really to blame for all of the problems in our modern world. MRAs, feminists, anti-Marxists, they all seem to be working from this bizarre top-down premise that our media somehow drives the real world, rather than our real world inspiring and informing those media representations of ourselves from the bottom up. I mean, Anita Sarkeesian isn't factually wrong about the damsel in distress trope. That is ultimately the plot of Mario. Plot is in scare quotes, obviously. The problem with Sarkeesian is really not her factual observations about narrative cliches, but that the social constructivist conclusions she draws don't logically follow from those facts. Mario doesn't enforce gender stereotypes, it is simply informed by them. Once you take out all the trippy shit like talking turtles and walking mushrooms, what you are essentially left with is a woman. A princess. Literal fucking royalty who gets herself into trouble, and then it's up to some poor, working class plumber who's expected to risk his life trying to save the bitch. To the extent that you can argue Mario even has a narrative, it's not an inaccurate representation of male disposability and white knighting for women who are ultimately considered well above your social station, all in the hopes of future reproductive access. Or in Mario's case, future access to cake. Much like the calculated attempt by Sargon to moderate real constructive thought by insisting we lock ourselves into a PR-friendly ideological framework like egalitarianism, Anita Sarkeesian's feminism might help to keep the cultural war machine rolling and the Patreon numbers up, but it is a completely inadequate mechanism to shed any meaningful insight on the underlying reasons behind even the simple video game goals of Mario. Now, this allusion to male disposability isn't to say that MRAs instead of feminists should be the ones pissed off at Mario. The point is that nobody should really be pissed off at Mario. To the extent that Mario is based on a trope or a gender stereotype, that trope ultimately exists because that is the way our real human reproductive biology ultimately exists. Mario is a disposable white knight for his high-status potential mate. Well, guess what? Most men are disposable white knights for their high-status potential mates. And most women, even the feminist women, like it this way. Logically, Mario should really be the he-for-she poster boy. Here is the bottom line about this kind of bullshit, where subjects that have real biological underpinnings are turned into yet another battlefield in the ongoing culture war of insert current year. Mario does not exist because of some institutional patriarchy. Mario exists the way he does for exactly the same reason that guys get themselves shot sticking their noses into other people's domestic affairs out of a misguided desire to try and save women they've never even met. Mario exists the way he does for the same reason that if a woman hits a man and he dares retaliate, a horde of thugs will descend and beat the ever-living shit out of him. Mario exists the way he does for the same reason that snivelling male feminists like Jonathan McIntosh and David Futrell will get online to debase themselves and their entire gender, in the hopes that one of their feminist princesses will pat them on the head for being a good man. Mario exists for the same reason that these very same feminists who hate on men will expect men to save them when they get into trouble. Mario exists the way he does for the same reason that so many men never made it off the Titanic alive, and why no women were sent against their will to the Vietnam War. Mario exists the way he does for the same reason that some thug will beat the shit out of a guy for being rude to his girlfriend after she tries to cut in line at a pizzeria. Trope has basically become a negative way of saying that something is a recurring motif. But there are clear, obvious reasons why these things become recurring motifs in the first place. As I mentioned at the start of this video, there is a real-world logic that even underpins South Park jokes. There has to be, otherwise we wouldn't understand the punchlines. Like it or not, there is actually a real, biological, reproductive logic which underpins this very simple video game goal of rescue the princess. The very reason this narrative trope exists is because it's the same biological reproductive logic that also underpins so many other aspects of male-female dynamics and goals in the real world. The reproductive goal underlying Mario is really no more sexist than the mathematically exaggerated bodies of Marcus Phoenix and Bayonetta. The low-status male risking his life to protect the high-status potential mate is exactly what we'd expect to see when male-female relationships are reduced to their most basic components and turned into a video game goal. Mario is a simplified behavioural caricature that represents real-world reproductive access. Changing Mario to accommodate high-minded ideological ideals about egalitarianism, feminism, men's rights activism, or whateverism isn't going to improve real-world gender equality for men or women. It's just going to make a surreal children's game even less grounded in the real-world reproductive reality that we all know actually exists. I mean, whatever side you're on, that's ultimately the theoretical win state of this never-ending culture war. It's not going to change the world and save marriage, stop the patriarchy, or encourage widespread empathy for men. It's just going to make Mario a shit game that people don't want to play because simple character motivations will no longer make sense in terms of our real reproductive biology. I remember Mundane Matt covering this post years ago back when he had the original blue skull head in a video titled In Defense of Guybrush Threepwood. Now, you may have read this post before, but I think it's worth reading again because it touches directly on the underlying problem here. Quote, "Do you know why there are so many white male characters in video games, especially leads? Because no one cares about them. A white male can be a lecherous drunk, a woman can't or it's sexist, sexualizing women and what all. A white male can be a mentally disturbed soldier whose mind is unraveling as he walks through the modern battlefield. A woman can't, or you're victimizing women and saying they're all crazy. Consider Guybrush Threepwood, star of the Monkey Island series. He's weak, socially awkward, cowardly, kind of a nerd, and generally the last person you'd think of to even cabin boy on a pirate ship, let alone captain one. He is abused, verbally and physically, mistreated, shunned, hated, and generally made to feel unwelcome. Now let's say Guybrush was a girl. We'll call her Galbrush. Galbrush is socially awkward, cowardly, kind of a nerd, and generally the last person you'd think of to even cabin girl on a pirate ship, let alone captain one. She is abused, verbally and physically, mistreated, shunned, hated, and generally made to feel unwelcome. Now, you might notice that I've given the exact same description to both of these characters, but here's where things deviate. While no one cares if Guybrush takes a pounding for being, for lack of a better term, a less than ideal pirate, Galbrush will be presumed to be discriminated against because of her gender. In fact, every hardship she will endure, though exactly the same as the hardships Guybrush endured, will be considered misogyny rather than someone simply being ill-suited to their desired calling. And that ending, she goes through all of that trouble to help, let's call him Eli Marley, escape the evil clutches of the ghost piratess LeChuck. It turns out he didn't even need her help, and she even screwed up his plans to thwart LeChuck. Why, it'd be a slap in the face to every woman who's ever picked up a controller. Not only is the protagonist inept, but apparently women make lousy villains too. And that is why Guybrush exists and Galbrush doesn't. Men can be comically inept half-wits, women can't. Men can be flawed, tragic human beings, women can't. And why? Because every single female character reflects all women everywhere. End quote. Like I said, there is no culture war, there is just culture. Ideologues fighting over whether this or that is an appropriate fictional representation according to insert identitarian agenda here is a big old waste of everyone's fucking time. The fact that Guybrush exists instead of Galbrush doesn't prove patriarchy, and the abusive, slapstick comedy reasons behind this gender choice doesn't spread misandry either. It just means that there are real, underlying biological reasons behind these narrative gender choices which otherwise wouldn't make sense to our evolved human brains. Galbrush would be perceived as an awkward, out-of-place mess like Cameron Diaz singing the penis song. Like the original post itself, you can come up with all kinds of perfectly reasonable, intellectual, rational explanations for why that is. But the simplest, most reductive explanation is that our brains would simply reject this female Galbrush character because, like Bayonetta and Marcus Phoenix having their physical body types swapped, Galbrush strays too far from the realities of real gender dimorphic behaviour and social treatment that we all know and understand. On a real, visceral level, people just don't like seeing women get knocked around, abused and mistreated. Whether you like it or not, men, however, are reproductively disposable, so the male Guybrush serves as an appropriate vehicle to tell Monkey Island's depressing, ironic slapstick story of a hapless, incompetent loser. The insistent framing of these issues as being part of a culture war is a misdirection, because these things like Mario and Monkey Island and Home Improvement and Glee and GTA do not represent problems happening at the cultural level. Yeah, assuming they're even problems at all, they're happening at the biological reproductive level. The culture war. This is not a cultural conflict. This is a biological conflict. The culture that we see is just the visible outward expression of that biological conflict.